As I said in the beginning of my intro, the northern warlords who control the current Afghan government maybe a notch better. Certainly, there's an elements of them that are no better, but there's some. I mean, I think there's certainly some. There are women in parliament, and that you certainly wouldn't have under the Taliban. So there's something. There's something there.
There are women in the parliament. There are women in science and business and education. That was not possible. But let's be clear: 25% or less of people in Afghanistan live in cities. 75%, 3/4 of the population, live in tiny villages scattered over an enormous territory. And those gains for women, which are very real in Kabul and Kandahar, but pretty much nowhere else, those gains have not reached the vast majority of women. So after 18 years of war and near US occupation, Afghanistan still has the worst record in the world for infant mortality. And it's just barely coming out of its old days of having the worst record for maternal mortality, slightly better for some women. So that has improved a little in some areas. But for the vast majority of women, they have not benefited in the ways that we see so much publicity around, that yes, there are women in the parliament. That's a good thing. And women are going to have a very hard time of it. They're going to have to fight their way back, fight their way to human rights the way they've always fought for human rights. But it can't be imposed from outside. It simply doesn't work.
Larry, what's your take?
Let me leave the minutia for a moment. The minutia is important. There's no question about that, particularly for the Afghans, certainly for the Indians and the Paks and others in the region. But let me just leave that for a moment and go up to the strategic stratosphere, if you will. The great game is back on again. The missing player, of course, is the most powerful player at that time, in my view, Great Britain. Now a middling power, as Jeremy Greenstock called them recently. But the great game is back on again, and replacing Britain, if you will, and I mean in terms of power dimension and proximity, is China. Afghanistan sits athwart a portion of what China plans as its Central Asian, its most important base road initiative. Billions of dollars have already poured into Kashmir as an experiment and created a 30-kilometer wide corridor through Kashmir. One of the most peaceful things that's happened in Kashmir in a long time. This is going to involve an enormous competition, already is involving an enormous competition. The one missing player in significance being, oh yes, the United States of America. Why on earth would we want to pull out of a place that is virtually impossible to get into without enormous help from states like Pakistan, Russia, Uzbekistan, and so forth, all of whom we had assistance from in 2001? Why would we want to leave a bastion in the great game at this particular time? I'm not talking about state building, an effort at which we have failed abysmally, just like we have every other time we've undertaken it. I'm talking about real strategic necessity if you're going to remain a player in the world and in one of the most important and going to be increasingly important regions in the world. Whether you're talking about oil, gas, or simply China's ability to get into the soft underbelly, if you will, not only of Turkey and that area, but also Europe. If you're looking at it from that point of view, Mike Gerson, whom I have no love for, he was Bush's principal speechwriter when I was in the administration, had an op-ed in the Washington Post yesterday which touched on this, and most of it I agreed with. I didn't agree with the cavalier method in which he dismissed American casualties, but which is a trait of the neoconservatives. But I did agree basically with the strategy he was talking about. We need to be there. And by the way, underneath that, we need to be there, our NATO allies who are not anxious for us to leave, to a state they're not anxious for us to leave, can help do the things that they do much better, state building, and help the Afghan government, corrupt and foul as it is, become more legitimate in more of the Afghan people's estimation, which is the most important thing for creating an Afghanistan that can stand on its own feet, and at the same time, deal with Pakistan's efforts to make sure that doesn't happen. If we stay there for this very strategic reason. And we stay there as a lily pad, as Jim Jones used to call it, that we can light on at any given time without having to go through all the machinations we had to go through in 2001 to get there. It was so frustrating for Donald Rumsfeld at the time, no love for him here either, that he literally cursed the Army and its chief of staff for not being able to get into Afghanistan quicker. Well, Don didn't know much about geography or about maps. So why leave now? And this is a counter view to all my veteran colleagues who want us out instantly. The ones I talk to, Marine and Army, who think we've just failed miserably. And even though their buddies have died and been horribly wounded there or come home with PTSD or brain injury or whatever, they want us out. And this is almost across the board with the people with whom I talk. A few regret the fact that we haven't done better and that we failed so miserably, and they're ready to admit the military was central to that failure. But they want out, and they think I'm crazy when I start talking about this higher level strategy. Nonetheless, I'm compelled to do so because all you have to do is look at a map, look at the competition in that region right now, and it's more important than the Levant. It's more important than Africa. If you're going to get out of somewhere, get out of Mali, get out of Somalia, get out of Sudan, get out of Niger, get out of all those countries that you're now contaminating with your military presence, Syria, Iraq, perhaps. But don't get out of Afghanistan. It's the one place in the world where you are that is genuinely strategic for you to be there.
The people of Afghanistan are not minutia. This is their country, not our country. There may be a great game.
I wasn't talking about them being minutia. I was talking about the detail with which you were elaborating and Paul was elaborating the problem in Afghanistan. That's not the people. That's the minutia.
For the people who live there, those things are not minutia. And I think that
I dare say just like the deaths in Minnesota aren't minutia, but they're not strategic.
Exactly. But it's what we in our high palaces of Washington might view as strategic in a great game somewhere are the lives of Afghan people. And it's our troops, our pilots, our bombers, our special operators, all of them, who have been responsible for civilian deaths. We are responsible for that, and we need to end it. That's the most important moral reason for pulling out. Are there strategic reasons? Sure, I could come up with some. We could argue that all day. But at the end of the day, this isn't our country. And we don't get to decide that whatever we do in Afghanistan is more important because of what it means for our country than what it means for people there.
Oh, I dare to very, very boldly disagree with you there.
Okay.
Very boldly disagree with you. If you're going to feel that way about it, then let's come home from everywhere and let's get inside our borders and call ourselves America is great again.
No, I think it means that we engage diplomatically and not militarily. It's a lesson we've never learned very well, but it's one that the failure to learn is coming back to haunt us in incredibly powerful ways.
Yeah, we did it pretty well from 1950 to about 1980.
We could argue that one too.
Let me break this down because there's two different issues here. What's good for the Afghan? Well, let me just start with two. There's what's good for the Afghan people, and then you got to break down in the strategic argument, Larry, is what you're saying actually good for the American people? Because the strategic vision you're giving is, the great game, as you say. But when was the great game good for the American people as opposed to the American elites?
Or for the British people as opposed to the British elites when it was being
What is the world about but elites in leadership, in education, in every walk of American life? That's true. Indeed, in every walk of every state's life, that's true. Are we going to discard the elites because they happen to have a vision that conflicts with ours? Well, I suggest you'd better get busy and have a revolution.
Well, that's what we're trying to do. We're as busy as we can be to have such a revolution. So, that part, I'm in full agreement with you. But that doesn't mean up until that point of a successful transformation of the United States, we can't advocate for a strategic vision which leans toward not maintaining dominance. And I'm a little surprised to hear this from you, Larry, because you're usually arguing against the strategy of trying to maintain global dominance.
Go back. No, I'm not talking about global dominance. I'm talking
but global dominance,
a competition with our principal adversaries in the world, which is heating up, regardless of what you and I say about not wanting it to, and is almost unavoidable if history tells us anything about great power competition. What I'm saying is, underneath this, go back to 1953. You will see the same arguments. You will see rather weak arguments, I think, on the progressive liberal side, if I may be so bold as to say that, but you'll see the same arguments about staying in South Korea. We nonetheless stayed in South Korea. We didn't stay in South Korea because we feared North Korea. We stayed in South Korea because we feared the Soviet Union. And it gave us a place from which to launch the defense of Japan and Global O Plan 5001, an O Plan I had a lot to do with managing in the 80s. Very important in terms of the Cold War. Now, if you want to dismiss the whole Cold War as a farce, that's fine. I'll do that discussion with you. But that's what we did. And defense of Japan was key to that. And our position in Korea was key to that. Guess what happened underneath our otherwise strategic position in South Korea? One of the most capable, competent, economic, democratic republics on the face of the earth grew up to be the power it is today. It made history. It's the first country to go from being a debtor nation to being a creditor nation in less than a generation. We didn't have that intent in mind. Maybe some of us did, but not very many of the elite. But nonetheless, that's what happened. If you stay in Afghanistan long enough, the people will get their act together, just for the simple reason that you're there as a chapeau for their doing that, even though that might not be your intent.
Why do you think, Larry, that the vision that U.S. war makers who went into Afghanistan have for that country is what the people of Afghanistan would define as getting their act together?
Let's just focus on Afghanistan, because there's been 20 years of U.S.